I thought that no Audrey Hepburn film could be worse than Green Mansions, but Bloodline has raised the bar, or lowered the bar, or tripped over the bar, dug a hole down into the ground, excavated a mine shaft to locate the bar in some subterranean place near the center of the earth, taken the bar from that place and brought it even lower. I covered Green Mansions on this channel a few months ago. I don't usually do bad movies here. I'm not really into ranting about movies. I'm not really into watching bad movies for the sake of bad movies. That movie had some interesting aspects, though, so I talked about it. And this has at least one interesting aspect, which is that it's even worse than that movie. There's a couple other things, too. So I figure it's worth addressing. First of all, this movie has an insane cast. An incredible cast, I should say. Audrey Hepburn, of course, Ben Gazzara, James Mason, Irene Pappas, Michelle Phillips of The Mama and the Pappas, no relation to Irene Pappas, Maurice Ronay, Romy Schneider, Omar Sharif, Beatrice Straight, and Gert Frobe. Incredible. Directed by Terrence Young. Not a super famous director, but he directed a number of James Bond movies like Dr. No, and he directed the film Wait Until Dark, which is probably one of the things that inspired this movie that thought, let's put Audrey Hepburn in another sort of thriller. Spoiler alert, this is not really a thriller. Well, it's not thrilling. Let's put it that way, at least. This movie's rated R. Definitely does not need to be. But perhaps that was some kind of marketing idea. The film opens a bit like a James Bond movie, except not a very good James Bond movie, a very vague James Bond movie. There's a guy climbing. It turns out it's the CEO of Roth Pharmaceuticals. In most movies, Roth Pharmaceuticals would be the bad guys, but in this movie, they're the good guys. I'll talk more about that later on. But the beginning of the movie, it's missing everything that makes a James Bond intro good, usually. There are no hair-raising shots. There's no great stunt work. There's no intensity. There's just a guy climbing a mountain, a long shot of a guy climbing a mountain, and then some figure looking through some kind of weird orifice that turns out to be just a spotting scope. Guy falls off the mountain, and you see a dummy being dropped down the cliff, bouncing around and falling to its death. Well, dummies can't really die, but I think you get the idea. Turns out the CEO of Roth is assassinated, and this is what's going to set off the events of the film, except that most of the events don't make any sense and aren't really set off by this thing in the beginning. When the CEO takes a tumble, of course, we think, oh, this is going to be the mystery. We're going to try to figure out who was this person looking through the spotting scope, who sabotaged the climb, and how. Spoiler alert, none of these questions are answered. The movie actually switches gears many times, but one of the gears it changes to is being a bit of a whodunit, where we're really trying to figure out who the bad guy is, and eventually the bad guy is identified. And when you learn who it is, it does not illuminate any of these events. It does not illuminate much of the story. It's still not clear who the guy with the spotting scope was. It's still not clear what this accident is about, how it happened, how it was arranged. Anyway, this is kind of does get the plot rolling a little bit, though. So without the CEO of the company, there's a bit of a power vacuum. The direct descendant, the next in line, is Audrey Hepburn. I honestly cannot be bothered to keep track of what the characters are named in this movie. I think maybe her name was Elizabeth or something, but really, I can't be bothered. So it's not really clear. There's some will or something like this. It's not really clear how this all works out. Why Hepburn is the one who's next in line. Her father, CEO, seems to be very diligent, very deliberate when he was alive, but didn't apparently have much of a plan for his next of kin. A bunch of the family members come together. This is, like I said, Audrey Hepburn is next in line, but she has a bunch of other family members. It's not really clear who they are. You sort of get introductions to these people, but they're extremely vague and hard to keep track of. This is where most of the famous actors in the film are, though. It turns out that most of the Roth family want to take the business public so that they can get rich. They sell the business, essentially. They sell shares in it. They take the money and use it to pay off their various debts, which it turns out they all have. Audrey Hepburn isn't so sure she wants to do this. She decides to take a trip to her father's hometown, where she's treated to a really bad flashback. Just a horrible, horrible flashback scene, completely useless, hokey, looks terrible, where we get a story, the stupid origin story of her father, essentially. This inspires her, for some reason, to take control of the company herself, and not have it go public. Those things aren't really mutually exclusive, but in this film they are, I guess. As soon as she decides to do this, well, so they're in the boardroom sitting around. She announces this decision to everybody else. Everybody says, nobody's very happy about this. And a moment later, a police detective, Gert Frobe, walks in and reveals that the father was murdered. He has some vague evidence for this. I don't even remember what it was. Reveals that the father was murdered, and suddenly the tone shifts into some sort of murder mystery. One of the biggest problems with this movie is that it's really inconsistent. It is caught between a bunch of different genres and a bunch of different eras, which isn't too surprising, given that it's a movie that has James Mason in it, Ben Gazzara, and Michelle Phillips. That's not exactly a cohesive group. It shouldn't be that surprised that it's all over the map. It starts off as a James Bond film. Then with the flashbacks, we get some sort of nostalgic historical film. Then it's a boardroom drama for a bit. Then Audrey Hepburn goes on a tour of the facility that is set to like disco music, and we get like this weird modern view of like, wow, look at industry go and such. Ennio Morricone made the music for this movie, and I'm a big fan of Ennio Morricone, who isn't? I've listened to a lot of his scores, including a lot of lesser-known ones, and I can confirm that they're not all winners. But it isn't so much the music itself that's bad here. It's just how inconsistent it is. When we have this flashback scene, when Audrey Hepburn visits her father's village, we get sort of classic Morricone kind of Western nostalgia music. And then, like I said, we switch over to disco when we get this sort of modern factory tour. Really incoherent. Audrey Hepburn's first order of business leading the company is to take a vacation. At some point on this vacation, she learns that her father thought that one of the family members was deliberately sabotaging the company. And the idea with this was that they wanted to force the father to take the company public so that there would be a payday. Like I said, each of the siblings, it turns out, have various debts. Of course, it's not clear how sabotaging the company would necessarily guarantee that it would go public. It could also just make the company go out of business. And of course, sabotaging the company would lower the stock price of an initial public offering kind of thing. So the plot doesn't really make any sense. But it's also not really clear, like I said, how the will is constructed, how this works. Why do the family members why would they benefit from going public when only Audrey Hepburn benefits when they don't? And when they retain ownership of it, apparently they don't make the family isn't entitled to any of the profits in this case, but if they were to go public, they would be for some reason. Anyway, in parallel, we kind of start to look into the lives of each of the family members. This is completely undercooked, very weak characters, very vague. For instance, Omar Sharif plays a husband with 2 wives and 2 sets of children. He's trying to keep them apart. This is some kind of comedy. The tone, it just switches again. It just falls so flat and is just so needless. And none of the characters are developed to an extent where you actually can even remember who exactly they are, or what they're supposed to be, or what their angle is, what they care about. It's a disservice to the phenomenal actors who are in this movie, just how bad this aspect is. Gert Frobe plays the detective in this film. He doesn't really do any detecting. Instead, he sits in front of some computers, and they talk to him, sort of computer text-to-speech sounds, movies from 1979, and they tell him a bunch of random facts about the various family members and sort of cast suspicion on one person or another. And this is probably one of the worst, one of the weakest, most unrealistic computer scenes I've ever seen in a movie. Just makes no sense. And it's just so clearly from a time before there was any sort of mainstream computational literacy. They also try to sort of imply that the detective becomes friends with the computers or something like that. It just really falls flat. Another aspect of this movie that's just really bizarre, like I said, is that the pharma company here are the good guys. And there's all these weird moments in the film that try to engineer a way to cast the company in a good light, these contrived ways that paint Roth Pharmaceuticals as the good guys. Essentially, it's this great altruistic company and such. For instance, when Audrey Hepburn first says she's going to run the company, one of the family members says, well, wait a minute, there's a lawsuit against us for pollution. And Audrey Hepburn says, kind of matter-of-factly, smugly even, oh, the river was already polluted, but we will pay our fair share, 18%, I think. We'll pay that and nothing more, in this very matter-of-fact kind of Audrey Hepburn moralistic way. Bizarre. when Ben Gazzara, who's kind of the chief operating guy at the company, gives her this tour I mentioned earlier, they visit one room where the company is sort of forced to keep a bunch of lesser used products. They have to keep them on file. They complain. They say, well, nobody ever buys these things, but we keep them around because we're just nice, or something like this, out of the goodness of our hearts. Like I said, it's just kind of perplexing the way that the company is treated in this film, even down to the headquarters of the company, which looks incredibly fake, looking like it would be, the headquarters of the bad guys. Perplexing that these are the people we root for, and that Audrey Hepburn, of all people, is kind of the figurehead of this whole thing, morally speaking. One of the plot lines in this film, in sort of the boardroom drama phase, is that the company is coming to the end of its loans, and they need to convince the Swiss to give them more money. The day before this meeting, Audrey Hepburn decides, well, I'm just going to lie to the bankers and say that we have a big product coming. She's apparently emulating her father in doing this, a gutsy, bold call, showing her coming into what it means to be a businesswoman. Her secretary says, oh, by the way, you should talk to this guy in the lab. And it turns out that one of the scientists in the lab is on the verge of inventing an anti-aging drug. Yeah. A breathtakingly stupid turn of events in the film. That said, there might be some interesting attempt at intellectual substance in this film with the anti-aging drug, given that so many of the stars in this film, like Audrey Hepburn, are a bit older. There's a scene later where Audrey Hepburn is in a restaurant and is visibly jealous of younger women. Ben Gazzara in the scene tells her that many years ago he thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world. So maybe there is some idea of loss that's woven into this film. And who knows? Perhaps the impossibility of the anti-aging drug is a very slight virtue of the film. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I don't know. Maybe it's an attempt at some sort of substance. Anyway, Audrey Hepburn goes, she meets with the bankers, and she asks them to extend the loan. Why? Because she has a great new product that she says will smash all sales records. What is it? It's a secret. She can't tell them. This is truly the art of the deal. The bank CEO takes her aside privately and doesn't ask, hey, what's this thing, the secret? Instead, he says, I'll give you the money if you make Ben Gazzara the president. And she says, well, we can't do that because he isn't a Roth. Okay, this isn't actually how the world works. There are plenty of companies where traditionally the CEO is, part of the family, but very rarely is this encoded in any sort of legally binding contract. There's plenty of companies that have done this for many years and then abdicated on that. For instance, the Lego company, which used to be a family business for many years, no longer is. But the bank CEO says, well, that's not a problem. You can just marry Ben Gazzara and then make him like the president of the company, and then we'll extend the loan for you. I'm sure this is how business tends to work in the real world. Audrey Hepburn, as always the romantic, says, okay. Turns out that the scientist who is working on the anti-aging thing is murdered later on in the movie. So Roth is kind of screwed either way, but the film ends before anybody realizes this. So are their bank loans going to get them in trouble later? Who knows? The movie ends. This marriage angle obviously is dumb, and it's executed poorly. It's even worse than it sounds. Ben Gazzara in the beginning seems upstanding, competent, seems like a decent guy, but as soon as he marries Audrey Hepburn, we learn that in fact he sucks. He's cheating on her with Romy Schneider. I'm not going to spoil the whole movie here, but it turns out that Ben Gazzara is actually one of the main contenders for being the bad guy, which is kind of bizarre, comes out of nowhere. But that said, there might be something slightly deeper to this part, too. Possibly this is a comment on Audrey Hepburn's relationship with Mel Ferrer, which is somewhat controversial. I think a lot of people have kind of a negative view of this. Ferrer apparently was very controlling, or perhaps people were just jealous of him being married to Audrey Hepburn. Who knows? But either way, this idea of having married a murderer maybe taps into some of this feeling around Mel Ferrer and some sort of sense of tragedy in Audrey Hepburn's life, that she was married but was not happy in her marriage or something like that. That's a story that's told her about her quite a bit, either that she was not able to have a child for the longest time or that she was just generally unhappy. She's cast as this sort of tragic figure in many autobiographies that may or may not be incredibly factual, but anyway, this is the thing. This is a narrative. Maybe they're playing into it. One way to separate good Audrey Hepburn movies from bad ones, I think, is that the good ones have Audrey Hepburn as a somewhat dialectical character. She's not just a faultless lovely, moral, romantic, perfect, pure person. In the good movies, there's also naivete, right? There's also an undercurrent. She's an ingenue, an idealist, charmingly out of touch with reality. She's a phony, but she's a real phony, as they say in Breakfast at Tiffany's, the two sides of Audrey Hepburn. Where I mentioned earlier, sometimes she has this moral streak to her where she says something, well, that would just be proper to do it this way, or something like that. And in the good movies, she's wrong, right? And in the bad movies, she isn't. When you watch less complex movies, like Green Mansions, for instance, you only get one of these things. In fact, in Green Mansion, I'm not sure you get any sides of her. She plays a bird person. I still don't understand exactly what this character, Rima, the bird lady, is, ontologically speaking, but whatever. In this movie, Bloodline, shockingly, we actually do get both sides, believe it or not. And this could just be because the movie is so all over the map and so incoherent. But there is a real glimmer of an older and uncertain Audrey Hepburn, and this is the most substantive part of the movie by far. Like I said, there are moments of jealousy. Sadly, they kind of ruined that. I won't get into it, but there's really nothing great about this movie, but I'm trying here. There are moments of seeing Audrey Hepburn maybe get in over her head, overextend herself, be a bit naive, and be uncertain. I've said many times that uncertainty is, I think, one of the cardinal virtues of good movies, and there is uncertainty in this film on her part. The stupidest part of the whole movie is probably this weird subplot about strangulation. We see a couple of scenes that show a man making love to some woman, seemingly a prostitute, and then strangling her with a red ribbon, dumping the body into the river. The first time you see this, it seems like maybe there was some sort of accident in the cutting room, and they spliced in some scenes from a different movie. The second time you see this, you think, oh, it happened again. It's really not any more clear why the heck it's in the film. Maybe it's just a ploy to make the film more edgy, more violent. Eventually, Gert Frobe, the detective, is called in to help with the strangulation. There's a little bit of a glimmer of connection. The thing sort of comes together. And it turns out that the link is that the film stock, oh, right, these things are filmed. You can see them, filming them, which, again, maybe this is some attempt at substance here, talking about the filming of a murder, a snuff film, right? Snuff film, very interesting idea. In some ways, are all Hollywood films, snuff films, exploitative in some way, either in how they force a certain type of labor out of actors, or in a much more metaphysical way, in the way that they distill a moment into some kind of permanent thing. Perhaps both of those are akin to a murder in some ways, a strangulation, who knows. But the link apparently is that the film, which, by the way, it's not clear how the police ever get a hold of the film. Or maybe they find part of it at the scene. Anyway, I don't remember. It turns out the film stock comes from Roth Pharmaceuticals. Now, seemingly Roth would sell film stock to a lot of different people, so it's not clear how this actually links it to the company or to any of the individual people, but Frobe tries to use the computers to figure out where the film was sold. And it's inconclusive. This plotline has nothing to do with the rest of the movie, essentially. At the very end of the film, we see a bad guy. Well, let me just also say that the movie takes another sort of shift in tone. There's a bunch of assassination attempts against Audrey Hepburn. There was a boardroom drama and some dilemmas coming there. Well, forget about that. It's actually about her being assassinated and somebody cutting the brake lines in her car and all this stuff, right? So again, we get another kind of wild shift in tone. Totally half-baked and vague, of course. At the end of the movie, it sort of culminates with a final assassination attempt. Turns out, the bad guy is revealed because he's holding a red ribbon, which is the same ribbon used for the strangulation. That said, this person, the bad guy in the end, does not appear anywhere in the strangulation plot line. There's no link between him and the murders. I cannot tell you what he has to do with them. They're disconnected. The characters in this movie are so vague, you can barely even remember. When the killer is revealed, you can barely even remember who he is. What's his relation with Audrey Hepburn again? Who is he? What is it? What are his motives? How is he related to any of the things, the assassination attempts in the film? How was he around? Was he involved in these? Why? How did he carry these things out? Not clear at all. Or, from the very beginning, like I said, it's not clear how he has anything to do with the first events. This is just never filled in whatsoever. The movie just ends. And like I said, the entire strangulation plotline is never linked back to the movie. And if you offered me $100 to tell you how it's related to the film, I couldn't. I have no idea, right? Literally no clue how it's linked in at all. The main thing that I get from watching this movie is just a sense of bewilderment. This is not some low-budget film. This is not some campy slasher or something like that. This is a movie with a huge cast, an incredible cast, tons of famous actors. They must have paid a lot of money for all these people. How on earth do you make a movie with this many famous people in it and have it be so incoherent and so bad? I don't know. I don't know how you get this far and you just come out with something that has so many clear disconnects, so many weak performances. There was no producer around just to say, what are we doing? I don't know. That's Bloodline for you. That's it. Don't watch this movie. It sucks. Okay? I mean, I identified a couple of interesting, vaguely substantive things, a couple of resonances here and there. But for the most part, I mean, it's not worth it at all. I can't unrecommend this film enough. I think we have a new crown for the worst Audrey Hepburn film, and that is Bloodline from 1979.